So I recently saw Joe Folley, Unsolicited Advice, talking about life's meaning, and I thought he brought up some good points regarding some common confusions within the field. And I do think these are confusions within the field, as in the analytic tradition that's developed over the last 20 or 30 years surrounding the topic of life's meaning. And I think a lot of these confusions boil down to the inherent vagueness of the term meaning. And that's something that Joe seems to refer to as well. So let's take a look at the clip, and then I'll go into what concepts and distinctions I think might help.
I think one thing that's worth acknowledging about meaning is even if you do end up with a very subjectivist idea of meaning, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in your control, right? I think about this in terms of beauty, right? Beauty, most people are far more comfortable talking about subjectivism in beauty than they are in things like ethics and even in things like meaning. But nonetheless, it remains true that you can't choose what you find beautiful, right? If somebody shows me like a dog turd on the street, I can't choose to find that beautiful. It is, importantly, although it's kind of framed through my experience, it's outside of the direct control of my experience. I think that is important. It changes how we interact with these things. So I don't know, that's quite a lot of disparate thoughts, but that's...
So it's true, as Folley says, that even if you have a kind of view of meaning that takes it to be something internal to you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in your control. But I think the best kind of way of approaching this is to understand a distinction that the philosopher Iddo Landau explains in a paper from 2020. And this distinction is between internalism and subjectivism. Now, when we think about subjectivism, about meaning in life, I think that usually refers to, and we usually think of it as referring to, a kind of relativism about meaning. You know, whatever's meaningful is what's meaningful to an individual person. No one can say what's meaningful to someone else. People just kind of have their own meaning internal to them. And I think that's kind of a normal way of thinking about meaning, but something in the literature, and perhaps beyond the literature as well, in just general talks about meaning, something seems to have happened where people have started to conflate internalism and subjectivism, and Landau explains this quite well. He says, quote, "Subjectivism about meaning in life is sometimes employed to connote a certain type of relativism about meaning in life, the view roughly that the truth of claims about meaning in life is relative to the individual standpoints." Landau goes on to say, "Internalism is the view that what makes life meaningful has to do with what we commonly see as the internal sphere, that is, one's sensations, feelings, emotions, intentions, thoughts, views, decisions, etc." And this seems like a very sensible distinction to me, and keeping this distinction in mind, I think, clears up a lot of confusion when we talk about life's meaning. You know, I think usually if people say what makes life meaningful is subjective, they tend to think it's relativistic. But what we should note is that if this is how we're thinking of subjectivity, then if you have someone that says the meaning of life is just to do whatever makes you happy, whatever that is, each individual can decide, that's not actually a relativistic account, at least not in the sense that we're describing, not unless we're presupposing a notion of meaning that automatically assumes happiness. And I don't think we have reason to do that. You know, we usually think of meaning in terms of things to do with purpose or intelligibility or worth or significance. You know, adding this extra thing of happiness on there, that doesn't seem to be contained within the purview of the concept of meaning itself. And so if you have someone that says what each individual finds makes them happy is what makes their life meaningful, that's actually not subjectivist, that's internalist, because it's not describing a relativistic position. It's saying, no, actually, universally for every single person, it is the case that happiness is what makes life meaningful. They're just describing an internal condition. So it's not that they're describing an external, you need to, run 10 miles for your life to be meaningful. Externally in the world, they're saying, no, there is a condition that applies to everyone, but it's internal, and that is happiness. And so that's one distinction that I think can help clear some ground for better discussion on life's meaning. Now, the true subjectivist will be someone like A.J. Ayer. And Ayer said that the meaning in one's life is simply what one chooses it to be, either consciously or unconsciously. It's whatever they've oriented their lives around in terms of a purpose, in terms of a meaning, what we usually think of as meaning being something that they feel to be worth orienting their purpose around, that gives them, one might assume to be of some significance to them. Now, you can note that for one person, this might be happiness. Someone might think, oh, my purpose is just pure hedonistic kind of happiness. Another person might think it's love. Another person might think it's suffering. If you think a lot of Christian thought, of over the last few hundred years, there's this notion of suffering being central to life. That's far from happiness, Now, obviously, there's a completely different objective meaning of life imbued upon that. But just to give an example, it doesn't have to be happiness or love or anything like that. If you're a subjectivist, then you would think, you would think it's possible to exist a person who really derives meaning out of suffering, whether that's based upon some kind of internal psychological issue, doesn't really matter. If that's what they orient their lives around and that's what makes their life meaningful, that'd be a true subjectivist account of meaning. And so I think that distinction's useful to hold in mind, as well as the distinction between subjectivism in that sense and nihilism. If you're a nihilist about meaning, then you think it doesn't even really exist, The person who is orienting their life around love or happiness or suffering, it's not even that makes their own life meaningful individually, it's that actually it doesn't make their life meaningful at all. Whenever what they think is making their life meaningful, even subjectively, is a mischaracterization, or it's a kind of delusion, just in the sense that there is nothing that meaning is actually referring to that exists. They can orient their life around whatever purpose they want, but that doesn't mean that they can consider that meaningful, as if meaning is this real thing. Now, one last thing that I wanted to point towards is the fact that if we keep this distinction in mind and we focus upon what it means for something to be a subjective meaning of life or meaning in life, we can start to consider what that's actually referring to. What does it mean for something to be subjective? And you could think, well, it's to do with us saying that the domain and the realm within which meaning can occur is the subjective one. It's one's own perspective on the world. And recognizing this allows us to interrogate the metaphysical nature of this subjectivity. Are we just saying it's or maybe the ontological nature of it? Are we saying it's just a kind of propositional epistemological domain where meaning statements make sense? Or are we saying that in some way it's a metaphysical realm within which meaning can attain? And for my part, and this is what I outline in my PhD thesis, I think it opens the space for metaphysical subjectivity that also permits for universal meaning, in the sense that we can say one can have subjective meaning, and by that I mean meaning that is individual to one's own metaphysical perspective within one's own consciousness, that occurs to and for oneself without grounding it in an independent reality. And yet we can still say that although that is subjective to me, it can also be universal if we say that every experiencer like me, i.e. every other human, must also, in virtue of being an experiencer, have the same meaning. And that's what we get under idealism, which is kind of my metaphysical position, view that reality is mind dependent. But we can only start to approach that view if we understand the difference between internalism and subjectivism. And then we can start interrogating what the subjective is. Are we talking something purely epistemological? Are we talking something metaphysical? But yeah, I just thought I'd bring to light that distinction mainly between the internal and the subjective, because I thought it might clarify some of what Folley was discussing, and also, as I said, what I think a lot of the field gets wrong. A lot of the field has and does tend to discuss internalism or internalist accounts as if they are subjective accounts, merely because they describe an internal condition that needs to be attained in order to make one's life meaningful. But if that's universal and applies to every person, and you think that that is the case, it's not really meaning subjective in the way that most people think about subjective, as in relativist. Yeah, Just thought I'd bring that little bit extra, courtesy of Iddo Landau. I'd definitely recommend checking out the paper if you're interested. It's a good read, and it can definitely help to keep these distinctions in mind when discussing something as potentially confusing and vague as life's meaning.